Today we're going to be replacing front struts in a Mustang GT 2003. The procedures in this video will apply to pretty much any year, make, model, body style of any car or truck that has struts. We'll also be briefly talking about shocks and coilovers as well. So I'm going to briefly explain what a strut is, and then we're going to go through signs of a bad strut to, make sure you actually have a bad strut and it's not something else. So the purpose of a strut on the Mustang GT 2003, we have front struts and rear shocks, and I'll talk about the differences in a second. So the strut is an integral part of the suspension itself. You can't really drive the car without a strut installed. The suspension just wouldn't be supported. Unlike a shock, well, that's for shock absorption, so you could actually theoretically drive the car without shocks installed, although not recommended. That's really the difference here. Obviously there's a few other differences as well, which I'll cover soon. So there's quite a few things you can do to confirm whether you have bad shocks or struts even. The first one that a lot of people recommend is a bounce test. Now the bounce test, it's not very conclusive, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a bad strut or shock, but it's a good place to start. The idea is you press on the car itself with all your body weight, and what happens is when you press down, the car should come up and not continue to bounce. So that's what a bounce test is. It's just testing the suspension itself. But like I say, it's the suspension. There's a few more components at play here, but it is a good indicator of something you can do as a first step. So put all your weight down and the car should return to its position without continuing to bounce. So that's a bounce test. Another thing you can check is uneven tire wear. Now usually it's around the edges. You can see here it's slightly worn around the edge. It's not very clear, but it's on its way. That's mostly the common symptom of uneven tire wear. It's usually around the edges with struts. However, things like tie rods can also contribute to this with misalignment or whatnot. So again, if you combine the bounce test with this, you get an overall picture of what component it could be, and we're looking at the strut at the moment. So one of the most revealing checks you can do is a visual inspection, and the strut here has liquid inside, kind of like oil, and when the hydraulic system sort of presses, the oil in there sort of compresses and whatnot. And what tends to happen is the oil starts leaking out just up this sleeve here. You can see here. This is a very good indicator you have a bad strut when it's leaking like this, and you can see all the residue all around here. So this is safe to say it's shot without really doing any bounce test or anything else, so get that replaced. If it's not leaking, it might have a dent in it or something like that. Maybe a stone or something like that could have dented the tower itself, which makes it quite unsafe, so that's another sign that it might need replacing. The last two things are really well driving the car. It's more on feel. So when you're driving, you go over a bump, for example, the car might have low clearance, it's bottoming out, so you might find the bumps are sort of hitting the bottom of your car, especially on a Mustang GT. It's naturally quite low anyway, so you might sort of experience that. Another thing is the steering wheel can jerk, move or wobble when going over bumps. So you go over a bump and all of a sudden the steering wheel goes like this. It's another sign of a bad strut at the front end there. And also when accelerating, the front of the car goes up, or when braking, the front of the car goes down. So how that happens is when your front struts have quite a lot of play in them. With the bounce test, it's not restoring to its proper position. When accelerating, because the car's weighted on the front end, you're putting immediate power into the car by putting your foot down. The car goes like this, almost not quite like an aeroplane taking off, but that's sort of like the anti-pressure on the front suspension. So when you're accelerating, you might notice the front of the car going up, or when braking, it might sort of nosedive. So you're applying the brakes and the car sort of goes down like this. So again, the front struts aren't supporting this sort of power that you're putting in, so the engine load of accelerating or again braking, for example. And again, with that, it could be bushings or things like that, so you want to check these too. But with all these 6 tips, apply them all, and that's how you can sort of narrow it down to the front struts. Okay, so when replacing the struts, replace them in pairs. The last thing you want to do is replace one. You might get an uneven ride. You can really buy them in pairs, so I don't know how you'd probably get a hold of a new single one anyway. Yeah, safety concerns. You'll actually get poor handling, excessive body roll. So you go around a corner, you might find your car sort of leaning, changing lanes on the freeway, motorway. You might quickly change lanes and you notice your car has got a bit of excessive body roll. Poor steering, sort of covered that before. And poor traction, really. Like I said, with the acceleration thing, as your car goes up and it goes down, this can actually increase braking time, and yeah, it is a safety concern. So I do recommend checking them at 50,000 miles, so visual check, you know, everything I talked about before. When replacing anything critical in the suspension or steering, for example, you may need an alignment afterwards. So get it down to the alignment shop. For the most part, you might not notice much. Your car may drift slightly, so you know, it's up to you really, but again, I'd recommend getting an alignment. If you go to Pep Boys, you can get a lifetime alignment for around $160 for the life cycle of the car. Very worth doing. I recommend that. So before we get started, to clarify really briefly, struts, they support the weight of the vehicle. This is sort of key here. On the Mustang GT here, there's also a coil spring that helps with that. Other cars, you might just have a strut assembly, and that's where the spring is on the top end of the strut itself. So again, it supports the weight of the vehicle. Shocks, they dampen energy, they dampen the shock. So that's the difference between shocks and struts. You can sort of live without shocks, they're not an integral part of the suspension. And we've covered shocks and struts. The last thing I want to talk about is coilovers. Now, coilovers are used in performance applications. So say if you've got a race car, you take it to the track, you want to lower it for the track because there's no potholes or bumps like the streets. So with the coilovers, you can actually adjust these settings really easy on the coilover itself. Now, the Mustang GT 2003 stock, we have a coil spring, which I'll show you in a second, and also a strut, and that supports sort of like the front end of the suspension. With a coilover, it's all combined into one unit, and also gives you the ability to adjust alignment on the camber and caster and things like that. So it's one big integral piece. Now if you have a large truck or something and you want to put heavy duty wheels on it, you can just adjust them at the coilover and raise the vehicle. Again, if you want to lower it, the coilover itself allows you to lower the vehicle as well. So again, performance applications where you want to adjust the height of the vehicle for different applications, racetrack or whatever, and also various other things as well. So that's what a coilover is, and why you might have heard it in reference to struts and shocks. Okay, so now the wheel's removed. This is our strut here. You can see it goes up, and with the hood open, you can see this is the top mount of the strut itself. So we'll be removing this bolt here. And underneath, this is the coil spring, and on the Mustang GT 2003, the coil spring and the strut are separate units. Again, if you replace this with something like a coilover, this and the strut will be integrated. So what you do, if you put coilovers in, you remove this spring completely and just install the coilover in this position. As we're just replacing the strut itself here, this is the only thing we need to be concerned about with the purpose of this video. So we're going to get started. Crack the lug nuts so they're somewhat loose. We're going to jack the car up and we're going to place it on a jack stand. Naturally, the Ford Mustang GT, most body types are naturally quite low, so you will need a low profile jack, and just get some small jack stands. That'll perfectly do. The only thing we want to do is get the wheel off the ground and make the car safe. Alright, now the wheel's off the floor, just take the lug nuts off, move the tyre to the side, and we're going to need our jack for later. I'll show you soon. So now with the wheel off, we can come in here. You can see it's been leaking oil probably for a while now. It's left a huge mess on the coil spring, the lower control arm, the stabilizer bar is caked. One thing you can do, engine degreaser works good, but even cheaper, oven cleaner. You spray it all down, very cheap, about $1, and then just hose it down. This will look, you know, really nice again. So we're going to take the strut out now. Let's get started with that. So the first thing we're going to do, there's a couple ways of doing this. The service manual has you take off the caliper and also unplug the ABS sensor itself. Now the ABS sensor, it has a star-shaped socket. right here. Maybe, I'm not sure the size, but I appreciate a lot of people won't have the bit for that. So my method, we don't need to touch that, we don't need to touch the caliper, we just need to be slightly careful and vigilant. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to unhook this ABS sensor line here, just by pulling it out of this bracket. It sort of slots out and up. Now we do that to give this line some slack, so when we lower the control arm with the jack, we're not tugging on this and ripping anything. So we've got a nice bit of slack here. That's the only thing we want to do really with that. Now we're going to need a 24mm wrench. You can use a box end wrench, open end wrench, or a socket. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to take this one off right here. So 24mm, a 15th, 16th also works quite well on these without shredding the corners, so that's good. We're going to take this one top bolt off here. You can see the last one, it's just loose threads. And this bracket will take off the ABS sensor, and we can just swing that out of the way. So now the bolt's off, we're just going to leave it down there out of the way here. If you do take this sensor off, you can actually clean the sensor. There it is, that little nub there, with something like mass airflow sensor cleaner, you know. Don't use brake cleaner or carb cleaner or anything like that, it's quite sensitive. So you can clean that tip off there, no problem at all. So we're swinging that out of the way, and we're going to take on these two 24mm bolts right here. They might budge by themselves. If not, just keep the back of the bolt here steady with a secondary wrench. I think the bolt head's actually quite smaller, maybe around 22mm. Then we're just going to crank these two 24mm bolts off now. Now the nuts are off. Before we push the bolts out themselves, we want to bring the jack in. And this is just going to support the lower control arm, which is this sort of large metal piece here. And we're just going to press the jack against it underneath, just so it's supporting it. So as you can see right there. Now the next thing we're going to do, because we're not removing the brake caliper, we don't want to put unnecessary strain on the brake cable here. That's very important. Let's got one of these little hammers here. It fits nicely in the lug nuts, presses against the floor, and that will keep this front from falling towards me. It's still supported by the ball joint underneath, but it just gives it extra support. So now we have the jack, the hammer. We can press these two bolts out of here now. Alright, and that's it down here. So we're going to come up top now. And this is the only nut we need to remove here. Now what happens is when we turn this nut, the whole assembly moves with it. Not the outside, but the actual inside sort of pin. So leaving that tight down there and removing this first won't help, because it's actually inside the housing. So what we do, we just get a box end wrench, just like that, and we put a flathead screwdriver in the top, and that stops the inside from moving, and then we can loosen it with the wrench at the same time. If you have an impact gun, I'd recommend just getting that on here and see if you could just whip it off. You know, it might have so much torque it might just fly off, so that's good for you. So this is the idea here. We just keep the screwdriver steady and use the wrench to take it off. Easy. Okay, now the nut's off. Remember the orientation and the placement of the bushings and whatnot. So we've got this nice little washer here. Then we have a bushing, which has a metal sort of tube inside it. This is the orientation of the bushing, so flat side down. There's the metal tube. So they're the three things we need to take off. Now we can push this and slide it out the bottom. So not rocket science really. You can lower the jack, maybe get more room, but you really don't need to. Just hold the ABS cable down here so it's nicely out of the way, and just pull this up and over everything and slide it right out. So before you put the new strut on, compare your parts, make sure they're of similar length and the holes are roughly in the same place. The last thing you want to do is put on the wrong part. They do send them by mistake, it does happen. So I'll show you something pretty funny now. This is how a good strut should work. Okay, so you compress it down, you can see it return just like that. Good strut, in that sense anyway. Okay, here's the one we just took off. We compress it down. As you can see, it's a lot easier because I had to use two hands on the other one. You let go, nothing happens. Totally shot. And that is dangerous, would you believe? It's quite a safety issue. So yes, it's glad we got these off. Okay, so typically when you buy struts it won't come with these extra pieces. Again, I'll link them in the description below if you need to buy them separately. So remove the sort of protection case there, I don't really know what the word is. And there's also a bushing here, you can just take that off. There we go, so set that to one side. If this is cracked or damaged in any way, I recommend replacing it. Again, check the description below for that. And now this is our old strut. You can see, like the other one, no recoil or anything, absolutely destroyed. So let's go about replacing these. So these are the old ones. I don't know who had this car before, but you can see they're not actually a match. I do recommend replacing them in pairs, so it's a good indication they replaced them separately. And as I mentioned, you can get an uneven ride height when one's partially worn and the other one's new. So again, in pairs. Again, we're just going to replace the parts. So bushing on, you can leave that up there because when it bounces, it's just going to push it up anyway on the sort of recoil. Put your little case on. I suppose that's just to protect the things for getting contaminants in there. And then we're just going to slide this back on the vehicle. Now, as I mentioned, oven cleaner, really good degreaser. So I'm going to spray all this down, the whole lot. And we're going to leave it for, well, I don't know, 10-20 minutes. Then we're going to hose it all down, get it nice and clean in here. So now it's a lot cleaner, it's just drying. Yeah, it's not perfect, but you know, I didn't go crazy either. I just got the most of it out. So we're gonna get the new strut and we're just gonna poke it back up there and sort of bolt it down. Not to spec, but snug enough. Okay, so the strut's in, roughly. I'm just gonna put a bolt in here, just to keep it steady. One's fine. Okay, so we're just going to put our components back on now, our bushings and whatnot. So remember, flat side down, goes on there like so. That pushes down within there, just like that. Put the little washer on, and before we put the nut on, your strut should come with a fresh set of nuts like this. If they don't, I guess you could use the old one, it's up to you, I suppose. But before we put this nut on, anything related to suspension, anything that might shake or loosen to vibration, I recommend using some medium strength thread locker, so that's the blue one, and just put a little bit on the threads here. So medium strength thread locker, again it might not really matter that much, but I like to do it, it's just a habit. The last thing you want to do is something to come undone as you're driving, that would be very bad. So we're just going to put this down snug enough, and then we're going to go to the bottom and tighten those ones down. And again, if you want some of this stuff, all parts and things in the description below. Blue one is so you can sort of undo it again. The red one is like ultra tight Loctite, so that's the difference between the red and blue. Okay, so we're going to crank these bolts down now. Again, the 24mm. It's 148 foot-pounds of torque, so if you don't have a torque wrench, I'll link that in the description below. Then pretty much as tight as you can get it. 148 foot-pounds is, you know, really going for it. So there's a tip there. Medium strength thread locker on these two, and get these down. So we're going to get this bolt down now. It's 74 foot-pounds, so about half of those bottom ones. It's hard to get a torque wrench on here, especially when you're doing this, but go for feel. 74 foot-pounds. So we're going to put the ABS bracket bolt on now. This one's 21 foot-pounds. Not really critical to the suspension, I won't bother with the thread locker. Going to put the ABS line back on this mounting bracket up here. There we go. And if you did take off the ABS sensor here and gave it a clean, then it's 53 inch-pounds to get this little star-shaped bolt back on there. So we're just going to put the wheel back on, and we're going to do the other side now. Again, replace them in pairs. The procedure is exactly the same, really, and you'll probably notice the car handles and feels like almost a brand new car again, you know, going without this for so long. Okay, so I hope the video helped you. Let me know how you get on. Again, similar things apply to different year, make and models of the cars. I covered a lot of theory, why it happens, why you should replace it, so I hope you appreciate the information. Give us a like and subscribe, and yeah, support our channel. So thank you for watching.